Because first, even when you carry out an internal investigation, you don't always come with the smoking gun. So you may have a number of indicias or circumstantial evidence which raises questions and suspicions. And then what do you do with that as a company? Do you pull out from the country in which you are operating? If yes, can you pull out? Because you have also contractual obligations, you have local partners. Sometimes those local partners may be part of the problem. And if not, what do you do? Do you disclose? Don't you disclose? You try to fix. And how you try to fix? Do you have to fire people? But if you fire people, then there is labor law triggering, which is normal and absolutely vital in the market ethic legal system. So you have a number of parameters, and this was really a sobering experience from that point of view. I now much better understand how difficult it is for a company to even implement its own good anti-corruption policy when confronted with day-to-day management of very practical operations on the ground.
That was the voice of Nicola Bonucci. I'm Sarah Cole, founder of Cole Forums, a high-trust network for CEOs, general counsel and senior leaders. I'm the host of Insights from the Coalface, and through my podcast, private dinners and curated events, I bring together extraordinary leaders for honest, no-filter conversations that go far beyond the boardroom. Each episode features global experts, from neuroscientists and journalists to CEOs and ethicists, sharing bold lessons and practical strategies. We explore the science of trust and motivation, the power of communication, the role of ethical leadership, and how to balance high-stakes careers with a fulfilling life. Cole Forums creates the framework. You and your peers make the magic happen. Nicola has more than 35 years' experience within an international framework, including 30 years working in international organisations. Following 26 years at the OECD, including 14 years as General Counsel, he is now an independent counsel and lawyer and serves as the legal advisor to ICCROM, the International Centre for the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property. He is also an associate professor of international law at the University of Paris Cité and a member of the board of the Basel Institute of Governance. His areas of expertise include general international law, the law and governance of international organisations, anti-corruption and responsible business conduct. Nicola, thank you very much for joining us today. I am really excited to get into this. We met, oh my Lord, maybe 20 years ago when you spoke at my event. And by the way, you could hear a pin drop in the audience. They were hanging on your every word. And I think it's a testament to how influential the OECD has been in this world of compliance and ethics for many years. And Nicola, I'm looking forward to getting into that. But take us right back. I mean, I read up, I couldn't believe it actually. You were born in Milan to an Italian father and a French mother, right? So tell us a little bit about those formative years and what that was like.
Well, it's something you realize how lucky you are getting older, actually. When I was in Italy, yes, my mother was French. She was speaking French to us. We were replying in Italian because we wanted to be like anybody else in Italy. And then, more than the fact that I was born with an Italian father and a French mother, my luck was that I moved from Italy to France when I was 14. So I'm not only the product of, two different nationalities, but I'm also the product of two different cultures. And this is a real chance in life. I moved to Paris. I then integrated the French system. And when I turned 17, 18, and it was time to join university, I decided to do it in France, which naturally has an impact also on my legal mind because I'm a French legal mind more than an Italian one. So I'm nearly a mixture, a blended. And one of the interesting aspects is that when I'm in Italy, I feel completely Italian. And at the same time, I have a bit of distance with the Italians and in Italy, which is part of my French culture. And vice versa, when I'm in France, I'm totally French, totally integrated, and at the same time, I have a bit of distance coming from my Italian background.
Do you think it's impacted on your worldview, though? I mean, on the outside looking in, I think surely it's really helped you with your international or public international law perspective.
Yes, I think so, because I was used as a kid to realize that you were looking at people that may think like you, look like you, but on the other hand, they are not really like you are. And clearly from Italy, between Italy and France, there are not such a huge cultural difference, but still, and I think it helps when you work internationally to try to understand how the others are thinking about an issue, looking at the issue, because you can speak the same language, but if you don't have the same cultural background, words can have very different meanings. And naturally, there is also other aspects like the body language, like other ways of communicating that are really helpful in international negotiation that you learn almost instinctively by being raised in two different countries with two different cultural settings.
And then I know that you sort of began your career in the Food and Agriculture Organization, I believe, looking at natural resource law. So, feeding into what you've just said, how do you think your experiences there sort of grew that worldview and the international governance view?
Well, those were clearly very formative years for me. I joined the Food and Agriculture Organization. I was 28, um,
Mm.
and I was basically named expert on fisheries law, which I never studied at the university, only because I did law of the sea, as you can. and and you know, I remember vividly my first trip to Africa. I spent a lot of time in the Great Lakes region. I was dealing with fisheries law, so inland waters. And there was an FAO project, and the head of the project was a very seasoned person. And when I came out from the plane, I was greeted with the words, I asked for an expert, not for a baby, which, you know, it's an interesting way to get confronted to the reality. At the end of the day, we ended up by being best buddies, and we did a wonderful work together. But those were really working in technical assistant in Africa at the end of the 80s was super interesting. And also it was in fact, my first impact with the issue of corruption. Naturally, at the time, it was not my focus. My focus was to develop fisheries legislation, but in that context, naturally, there were issues about attribution of licenses. When talking with local officials or fishermen, you could very well understand that there was one issue, which was the selling of licenses to friends and favors and favoritism, and this was one of the complaints. And as I said, at the time, I wasn't really focusing on that, but it was really my first impact with bribery and corruption.
And do you think you were fired up from the start on the subject, or do you think that's only with hindsight now that you're looking back at it? When did it really grow for you as something you really wanted to tackle?
No, to be honest, it's
Mm.
really when I joined the OECD. As I said, it was part of the background. I found this shocking, and at the same time, Sarah, and I was born in 1960, so I'm also the product of my time.
Mm.
And I think we were more, I don't want to say the word used, but this was part of the picture that you would expect to see, in particular if you are coming from Italy, as a way of interacting, between human people. So I took notice of that, but to be honest, I could not really say I was utterly shocked by that. Also because of ignorance, and it's really when I joined the OECD that I realized, some basic things which sounds crazy now, but the fact that, for example, if you were bribing a public official abroad, this was not an offense. and you could do it. That was really shocking when I discovered that.
So you take your role at the OECD, and look, you were there for 25 years. So, and I know you culminated in Director of Legal Affairs, but you did other roles there. If you're looking back at that period, which obviously for listeners is probably the most interesting period, particularly because obviously the convention, you were part of that as well. But what was the biggest challenge that you faced during that period?
Different ways to look at this. From a personal point of view, this was a super exciting period. I came into an organization which was really transforming itself because of the geopolitical conditions. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the fact that the OECD could start to integrate some Central and Eastern European countries and was really moving from being a purely transatlantic organization to a global organization, not a universal one. It has never pretended to be a universal one, but a more global organization. So these were really exciting years in global terms because there were a number of openings. These were also the years, and I think it's very interesting, in particular when we think about it in today's geopolitical context, of a strong accent starting to be put on good governance. These were the years of the Clinton administration based on trade better than aid, on this idea that if we were helping developing countries to better govern themselves, this would address a major problem that they were and are still facing. And I think the diagnosis at the time was right and still is right. And naturally, those were also the years in which we started to develop the work on the leading to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which I was lucky enough to join from day one, actually before the convention was there. So the challenge was more the challenge of facing so many things at the same time. The spirit was a very positive and a very enthusiastic one, which again strikes quite strongly from the feeling that we have now, where we feel that a number of things that we have been building for the last 30 years are in jeopardy.
I mean, I remember reading that you felt that had you been negotiating the convention today, especially in recent, and we'll get into that in a moment, in recent months, that you would have probably found it much more difficult. I wonder, can you elaborate on that sentence for us, or that comment that you made?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm convinced that to negotiate an OECD Anti-Bribery Convention or United Nations Convention against corruption today would be virtually impossible. Again, because the time of the 90s was the beginning of what we have called globalization, which was also naturally purely and firstly an economic movement, but also a movement which was recognizing that we were living in a single world and that what you would be doing as a country could have an impact on other countries. And, I'm talking about anti-bribery, but the same could be said about tax, on which the OECD also worked a lot, on climate change, all the global problems. And there was this general feeling, this general idea that we need a set of rules of the game. And I think this was the spirit that we are seeing now putting into question when you basically put forward only self-interest without taking into account the collective view, and each country can have its own self-interest, but then if you put together 140, 150 different self-interests, it's very difficult to come to an agreed conclusion.
And on that, look, the elephant in the room that we really need to speak about is this pause on the enforcement of the FCPA. I know that you've been heavily involved in sort of voicing concerns around that. Can you tell us What are your thoughts on this shift?
The position of the President of the United States vis-à-vis the FCPA was well known because he already claimed his displeasure about this legislation in the very first days of his first mandate. The surprise, though, was the executive order and this approach of basically pausing enforcement altogether. I think everybody was expecting that there would be a shift in enforcement priorities, which is also what was pre-announced in a memorandum of the Attorney General, which was issued a few days before the executive order. But the total pause on enforcement was really unexpected. And we are now facing a situation in which not only you have the pause, but you can also see that the institutions and the people that have been in the front line for 20, 30 years, let's take, 1997, which is the signing of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, so let's say 28 years, are gradually being either disempowered or leaving the administration. So apart from what will be the fate of the FCPA in 6 months or in 1 year, there is also a big question about what are the human capacities left in the US administration to investigate and enforce such a legislation if such a legislation was to be maintained. So it is a very worrying signal. You said that I was taking positions. It is true. We sent a letter with some key players to the AG very few days after the executive order was announced. And the letter we sent, which was not due to be public, but in a transparent world, everything becomes public. So it is now public. The letter was really trying to dispel some of the basic misunderstanding that we could sense from the executive order. One of which is that, in fact, this was detrimental to US business. In fact, we maintain, and I would continue to maintain, that the FCPA is not detrimental to US business interest. It is, in fact, a protection, because in front of solicitation, like a UK firm or like a French firm, you can say, I'm sorry, but I cannot respond to this solicitation because it is a crime in my country to bribe a foreign public official. Now, if you remove this shield, you in fact weaken the position of the companies and put them in a much more difficult position to resist solicitation. And secondly, the other assumption, which was clearly not really based on fact, was that there was almost an implicit assumption that only the US companies had a legislation of that sort in place, which is not true. As you all know, UK Bribery Act, the Loi Sapin II, but no, there are 46 countries which are party to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, and there are many more which are party to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. So I think it's a reading which was based on the FCPA of 1977, when the law was adopted, but doesn't stand the test of reality today.
And did you get a response to your letter?
Not yet.
Okay, well, we'll look out for that. So I think what you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that the worrying aspect then, or the particularly worrying aspect, is not whether or not it's a strategic pause or a political recalibration, but that it might be a more or a deeper systemic challenge to how anti-corruption is even viewed, never mind enforced. And that's obviously hugely concerning, not just for the reasons you've outlined, but, the whole landscape of compliance and ethics as it's developed has been based around the legislation. I mean, certainly I've been heavily involved since 2010 when the UK Bribery Act came in. And that's when the big events started coming out, because there was an appetite to do the best that we could in terms of compliance and ethics back at the ranch in our different organizations. there's a sense of unraveling of a lot of the work that you've done, I suppose, for you.
Yeah, no, I think you are absolutely right. And again, if we try to broaden a bit the lens, we see also that the kleptocrat unit, which had been established in the DOJ, has been suppressed. There is also the putting into question of the Corporate Transparency Act. So it goes beyond bribery and the FCPA. You said you didn't want to put words in my mouth, but basically you have captured well my feeling, which is this is bigger in my view than only FCPA. Having said that, and going back to your point, which I think is crucial also for your audience, I think this is also a moment of truth for companies. It is true that compliance has been so far really driven by legislation. And I put in my mind a bit of a parallel between what's going on in the US vis-a-vis foreign bribery and what's going on in the European Union vis-a-vis due diligence. And you have the same, the situations are not comparable, but you have the same uncertainty about what the legal framework will look like in 2 or 3 years. And in my view, this is the time for companies also to pause and really assess, what do we stand for as a company, as a global company who wants to be doing business globally? And I think, it's time for them also to come with a very straight position on whatever the legal framework is. Our policy is that we will not bribe in order to obtain and retain contracts. Whatever, the general policy is, we will not violate basic human rights. And we will stand for that. I think it's the time for compliance in a sense to go beyond compliance and to be based, I would say, more on values which are good for business rather than trying to adjust to a very clearly shifting and unsettling legal framework.
I think it was some Transparency International figures I was looking at that said that 87% of G20 companies now have formal anti-corruption policies, when it had been only 56% in 2015. So that momentum, you would hope, wouldn't be unraveled by what we're seeing happening in the US. So I agree with you. I think hopefully, and business hates uncertainty, right? So it's for them to draw up their own approach to this and to not be swayed from their values as organizations. But I think ultimately, countries that were part of the OECD Bribery Convention, according to a report that the OECD produced, were 30% more likely to enact stricter anti-corruption policies. So whilst that's a goal that we both have, I think the reality we may see it impacted by this. So yeah, a lot of change potentially in the future, which is daunting.
Yeah, no, I think it would be a bit naive to believe that only, legislation and enforcement of legislation does not play a role in companies' policy decisions. And again, this is going back to this analysis of the pause. In a sense, if the pause would have been announced 10 years ago, the impact would probably have been much
greater.
Greater, for the very reason you indicated. Here you have now a number of countries that have moved forward. The UK with the UK Bribery Act, the French with the Sapin, and others. And the announcement, for example, of this alliance between the French, the Swiss, and the UK in terms of an anti-corruption task force is an interesting signal. But also, I would say, also countries which are more on the demand side, countries in which corruption or bribery happens, have also, by and large, moved in the right direction. So I think the mega trend has been there for a number of years, and it will be very difficult to completely reverse it. Clearly, it will make things more complicated. I think it's fair to say it would be unwise and as I said, naive not to recognize it. Also, in terms of, for example, international cooperation, the U.S. has been a great partner, in particular in the last few years, in terms of international cooperation. So, will they continue to cooperate, share information as they did in the past? God knows. But there are also other elements which pushing in the other direction. For example, investigative journalism is much stronger now than it was 10 years ago. Civil society, you have a number of countries in which you have strong civil society, including grassroots civil society, very, very well equipped in terms of being also more sophisticated in terms of, foreign bribery or domestic bribery. So you have a number of elements which go in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think there are things like, we're all in a hyper-connected world now. The transparency around that and the reputational damage to companies has definitely been on the radar of the companies that I'm speaking with, and that hasn't gone away. So yeah, let's remain hopeful, Nicola. I'm also interested in the next phase. You've left the OECD after 25 impactful years there, and you've transitioned to private practice. What are the sort of big differences that you've observed in working for an international organization and then advising global corporations on compliance?
So, Sarah, I did all my career from the age of 20 something to 59 in international organizations. So it was really a huge shift. I have to say, I don't regret it a bit in terms of indeed what I learned. And your question is a super interesting one. If I stick to the issue, anti-corruption, I learned a number of things, also in terms of human relationships, but this is another podcast. But in terms of anti-corruption, I was involved in several internal investigations in the drafting of anti-corruption policies, and it humbles you. Honestly, it humbles you because you are on the ground dealing with real issues which require real decisions, sometimes on a very short term or short time frame base, and you start to look to better assess the difficulties of implementing decisions in this context. We could have again a podcast on that, but very often it's very rare that you have a clear-cut yes or no approach. Because first, even when you carry out an internal investigation, you don't always come with the smoking gun. So you may have a number of indicias or circumstantial evidence which, raises questions and suspicions. And then what do you do with that as a company? Do you pull out from the country in which you are operating? If yes, can you pull out? Because you have also contractual obligations. You have, local partners. Sometimes those local partners may be part of the problem. And if not, what do you do? Do you disclose? Don't you disclose? You try to fix. And how you try to fix? Do you have to fire people? But if you fire people, then there is labor law triggering, which is normal and absolutely vital in the market ethic legal system. So you have a number of parameters, and this was really a sobering experience from that point of view. I now much better understand how difficult it is for a company to even implement its own good anti-corruption policy when confronted with day-to-day management of very practical operations on the ground.
So with that in mind, if you could run back to Nicola, starting off back 25 years previously. What is the one message you would give your younger self, having learned that?
That's a good question. I would say to myself 25 years ago, uh, be conscious that to be morally right is, I would say, a sine qua non but not sufficient condition. I.e., you may wish to do the right thing because you are morally entitled to do it, but you need to be careful on how you do it and what are the unintended consequences. And I think it's something that sometimes, you know, going back even to my long experience in internationalization, I would say that internationalization would benefit from having more people coming from the private sector experience, in particular when they start to deal or try to regulate how private sector operates. Because too often there are people like me that have never been in the private sector telling to the private sector, you should do that and not that. And as I said, I think after an experience in the private sector and not in the company, but really assisting companies, I can see that there are many, many gray areas in which, as I said, it's not easy to take the right decision. And probably you have to take a decision which is in the best interest of the of the company, but it's not the ideal solution in all. So that would be probably my strong advice to myself: be recognize that you may be morally right, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you would be effective or you would not lead even to sometimes unintended adverse consequences by your actions.
Yeah, I can remember years ago in one of the very first large events that I had, there was a lady, I won't name her, I remember exactly who she is, and she was running a large multinational organization, and she had some staff in Africa who were bribed at gunpoint, and they rang her asking her what to do, and she said, pay the bribe. Your life is more important, and we will sort it out, the mess of the bribe later. And I remember that sparked an enormous conversation for the very reasons you've outlined, because the reality sometimes you're under pressure and you have to make decisions where people's safety or whatever are at risk. And I think, yeah, that humility that you've just described is so important to appreciate, because good intentions don't necessarily mean on the ground you can make those decisions.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
another thing that you've spoken about, I mean, obviously the OECD's sort of covers the supply side of bribery, I guess, but maybe not the demand side. So you've said, and I may be misquoting you, but that you perhaps should have talked about the issue of asset recovery and covered it in the convention. Is that still your feeling, or do you think the scope perhaps could be expanded there?
Yeah, no. No. You absolutely correctly translated my thoughts. Yes, I would say at the time of the negotiation of the convention, there was a very legal approach to the issue. So basically, the negotiators, naturally at the time I was junior, so I was a backbencher, but the negotiators were looking at the issue from a purely legal point of view. So they identified the legal vacuum. The legal vacuum was the supply side, because there was no legislation in place except FCPA. And they basically had the beginning of discussion on the demand side, but it was a legal discussion. And it came very quickly to the conclusion that, well, in all countries, you have a legislation which prohibits public official to be bribed. Even in the most corrupted country, on paper at least, you have a legislation which will not allow domestic public official to receive a bribe. So there is no legal vacuum. So we don't need to look into that. Legally, it was valid at the time, still valid today. From a policy point of view, I think it's a missed opportunity. And indeed, if we had included provision on the demand side and asset recovery,
Mm.
we would have now a much more comprehensive convention, which could be also the object of monitoring. So, one
Mm.
of the difficulties is that the monitoring cannot really extend to the domestic bribery field, even though there are a number of ways in which, by addressing foreign bribery, you also address domestic bribery. And naturally, asset recovery is not covered by the convention, so we cannot really monitor what countries are effectively doing in terms of asset recovery, how effective they are in doing that. And given that one of the basic strengths, if not the basic strength of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention is the monitoring, we are now facing some limits, in my view, on how far we can push the countries.
Because the World Bank data that I was looking at from last year was saying that the emerging markets like Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa account for 45% of global corruption cases. So I almost feel as well that I think you once remarked on it, that the convention maybe hasn't got the reach there. Do you think that's something else that could have been a foresee? I mean, like, it's lovely, the hindsight perspective, isn't it? But
Yeah, no, and it's easy. It's very easy. No, but so one basic point is really something that I feel strongly about it. The reason why the convention was negotiated at the OECD at the time was not a moral reason. It was really a competitive reason. I mean, when the US decided that it wanted to multilateralize the FCPA, they decided to go for the OECD because this is where the competitors were. And if you go back in the early 90s, they're absolutely right. The early 90s was, as I said, the beginning of globalization, but China was still nowhere to be seen. I'm not even talking about India. The mid-sized countries in East and Southern Asia were really starting. So all the competitors were within the OECD. And this was the spirit. And the OECD, being an economic organization, it made a lot of sense from a sort of more competition law point of view than anything else. Now, given that the shift of wealth in the world has changed dramatically, clearly the fact that we don't have, the OECD doesn't have countries like China and India as a party to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, it's a minus. It's a minus not as strong than it could be, because there is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which also includes a foreign bribery provision. But the reality is that the monitoring of the implementation of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and I don't want to be dismissive of what my former UN friends are doing, but for a number of reasons, cannot be as rigorous than the one undertaken within the OECD.
Right, I agree. And just thinking about my listeners who will be mainly leaders, whether that's chief ethics and compliance officers, CEOs, or general counsel, how important do you think ethical leadership is in combating corruption? Because I think we've already touched on the reasons why the convention maybe didn't reach as many companies as we'd like now with hindsight. But there's more to it, isn't there? There's more around the leadership aspect.
I think it's vital. I think it's really vital. Again, you were asking me, if you were to talk to the Nicola Bonucci 25 years ago, when I wish, by the way, when the convention was negotiated, it was really negotiated in a very classical intergovernmental fashion, a bit of control and command, in which basically the idea was the companies are the problem. And therefore we need to rein in the misbehavior of companies. I think one thing that we learned in the last 25 years is, yes, companies are part of the problem, but they're also a big part of the solution. A big part of the solution. Because you cannot investigate and prosecute all cases, because a lot of cleaning and fixing is done within the companies. I've been talking about my experience in the private sector dealing with criminal investigation. So ethical leadership is key. And I like very much your wording and your way to presenting. It's ethical leadership. It's not leadership in terms of we need to respect the law. Sure, any company has to respect the law. But what do we do beyond that or on top of that? And one point that I think is very important in my mind is, how can I say, in a company, if you really want to have ethical leadership, it has to be at all levels. You know, there is a lot of talk about tone at the top. Yes, tone at the top is essential. But tone at the mid-ground, tone at the bottom is as essential, because at the end of the day, those are the people that are exposed because they're in the front line in very difficult market, in very difficult situation like the one that you indicated before, which have to take decision and sometimes take the wrong decision because they have not been really, how can I say, they have not really been entrusted with this ethical leadership that they should have as a representative of the company. And I think this is one of the big and the main challenges, is that the ethical leadership should really trickle down at all levels of the company.
I completely agree. And, I noticed this with the training around ethics and compliance. People on the ground were looking to their managers for guidance and leadership. Not tone at the top was good in many of the companies we worked in, right? They've been working on it a long time. There's been a lot of noise about it. And Tom Fox, who's also been on one of the podcasts, did a wonderful series called something like The Mess in the Middle. And he was surprised there was very little feedback on it, given how important a topic it is. And I think it needs a lot more profile. I mean, looking back at your own career, have there been pivotal moments where leadership decisions you could see had an impact on anti-corruption progress in the organizations they've worked with?
Well, one clear moment, which was, I think, a moment of truth for me and also for the OECD, was the British aerospace case.
Okay.
So we are back in 2006. I became general counsel 1 year before. And I was appointed by a secretary general that was on the verge of finishing its second mandate. So I had a new secretary general, Mr. Goria, who was Mexican, and who arrived and to take the helm of the organization in June 2006. And then in the days just before Christmas in 2006, the SFO announced that they were pausing or suspending the investigation on BAE. And I remember very well, this was, as I said, just before Christmas. So I was already on holiday, that I immediately sent a strictly confidential message to the Secretary General saying this is a major case and a major stress test for the working group on bribery. Because a country like the UK is a G7 country, this is a case which was very visible, very well known. Again, a case in which, for example, civil society and investigative journalists had put a lot of pressure. And for the working group on bribery not to react would really undermine the credibility of the WGB. And naturally, you are a new Secretary General. You want to be seen as friendly as possible to all the countries. You want to establish trust. So I was putting him in a very difficult situation, because I was basically telling him, we will need, to confront the UK. And I have to say that he supported me. He supported the Secretariat. We then had a lot of discussion with the UK, very difficult discussions. Most of them are on public record, which at the end of the day led to the adoption of the UK Bribery Act. So, so I think it was a success. But this could have been a very difficult situation. If I had a Secretary General would have told me, you know what? Yes, okay, but let them settle it. We are only the Secretariat. It's not our role. And basically, I don't want to displease the UK. I don't know what I would have done because this would have put me in a very difficult moral situation because I really thought that we had, as Secretariat, to take a role and direct the country in the right direction. So this was a pivotal moment, I would say, if I were to at least
And
identify one.
if you had to put your finger on it, was that about courage then? What was the leadership trait that he exhibited?
Yes. I interviewed the Secretary General on this and other issues in the context of a book, which actually is going to be released now, on, what are the qualities for a head of international organization, for a leader. He said, and this was very interesting, you need to do the right thing, but you need to do it at the right moment. Which I think is the combination of political nose and skills. I think on this case, like on another case which has nothing to do with corruption, which is on tax, but he demonstrated that he was also a very good judge of where the balancing of power was going. And I think we never really confronted each other on that, but I really think that he made a political calculation, but political in the right sense of the word, of, okay, I may displease the United Kingdom, but I will please a number of countries in the working group on bribery. And therefore, I will get the support that I need in order to push in that direction. So I think this combination of wanting to do the right thing, but also having the intelligence and the nose and the skills to do it when time is ripe, I think it's a very strong element of leadership.
Wonderful. And this book, when will it be published? Oh, should we look at
Very, very, very soon. It's not my book. I only contribute with an article, but I will send you the link. It's a book that has been.
I'll add it to the show notes.
It's a collective book which deals with leadership within international organizations, which is an interesting concept.
I agree. Obviously, leadership is definitely something we're focused on the podcast. Now, our time is sadly coming to an end. I wondered, I've got a couple of last questions for you, but I think the one I'm really curious about is if you had to choose a legacy from your life and your career, which is by no means coming to an end, but thus far, what would it be?
I'm not someone who has ever been looking at legacy because I like the time where I am, and so but I would say clearly there are two areas which I think we really manage collectively, and I don't, and maybe that I don't know if I'm a leader or not, but I believe much more in collective legacy than individual legacy. So I will speak more in terms of the OECD and my. I think there are two areas in which I think we really made a shift and the difference in the world. The first one, we've been discussing about it. And the second one is an international tax architecture in which we basically managed to overcome years of non-cooperation and bank secrecy and people taking advantage of loopholes in the legislation. And the two are very much linked. Because at the end of the day, for the system to be preserved and for people having trust in an international financial and economic system, you need to address people who are taking advantages and abusing the system. If not, the little world system will collapse, and then we will go back to protectionism and authoritarian views. And there is a risk now, for example, that the fight against corruption is more and more used for political purposes. And this really concerns me.
Yeah, it's like going back into dark times, I think. And finally, Nicola, although I'm sad to say finally, there is a question I'm asking everyone who joins the podcast. If you were to create a leader's survival toolkit with only 3 essential items in it, what items would they be and why?
So the first one is, I would say, relatively simple, and the symbolic is relatively simple to understand, would be to have a compass for a number of reasons. Because you need a compass to survive, and you also need a compass to lead you in the direction.
Mm.
The second one would be probably an elastic band, because you need also to be flexible. It's nice to have a compass, but you also need to adjust and to understand maybe that sometimes you need to deviate a bit in order to get back on the right path. If you are only strictly looking at that without taking into account, consequences, I don't think you're doing yourself a service in terms of survival as a leader. And the third one is a book that I read a long time ago and I reread recently because of the strange world in which we are, which is a book of John Stuart Mill on liberty. And what is interesting is that the first time I read it, I was very much focusing on the reading of it in terms of separation of powers, and and how it was responding to Tocqueville. And this time I noticed that there is something which, and that's really that is in the book, but it's not always highlighted in the book. It's a book on leadership. It's a book on leadership, because the book basically says, at the end of the day, you are master of your own destiny. You are your own leader. You're your self leader, and your leadership and your freedom is the guiding principle that you should have. And the only limit that you should have is that you should not exercise your freedom to the detriment of freedom of the others. And I think this is very sobering lesson, as I said, in particular nowadays.
Wow. Yeah, really poignant. Thank you, Nicola. That was amazing. I really enjoyed our conversation. I really appreciate you spending some time with us. And I feel there were at least 2 podcasts there, so you'll be hearing from me again. Thanks,
Sarah. It was a real pleasure.
That's it for today's episode of Insights from the Coalface, Elevating Leadership Beyond the Boardroom. I hope this conversation left you with fresh insights, new perspectives, and a deeper connection to the challenges and opportunities of leadership. If you found value in today's discussion, I'd love for you to share it with your network, leave a review, or reach out to me with your thoughts. Leadership can be a lonely road, but it doesn't have to be. Let's keep learning, growing, and supporting each other. Until next time, stay resilient, stay authentic, and keep leading with purpose.